before John and Shawn continue it this afternoon, I just wanted to let you all know where you are. So obviously we are meeting today on unceded, stolen, Syilx ancestral lands. Right now, this particular little part of land has this very strange relationship in that it is regional parks land leased by the university. So this kind of like palimpsest of colonial sort of imposition on these lands and waters. But if we sweep all that away, we have these amazing waters behind the home. Here is a creek and these forests. I have been working here for 3 years and I've started to learn a lot about this place. I'm so grateful, as are I know everyone who works here, so grateful to be able to work in this really beautiful environment that has been cared for by Syilx people since time immemorial. We are so grateful for that opportunity. It is a place where cottonwoods and cedars and the Douglas fir and the ponderosa pine all meet. And that's very unique in this kind of place we call Kelowna. It is also very thirsty and very dry. There's been a lot of drought that's been in this place because of the suburbs that are all built around it. So Denny will be able to tell you about the deer who come regularly visiting. Who might be a bit thirsty. The trees are a bit thirsty. So those of us who have the great fortune to work here try to spend a lot of time also paying attention to what these other non-human beings are telling us and asking of us. Upstairs in the field lab, we printed out the Syilx Water Declaration, and one of the parts of that declaration that was written by Syilx people in 2014, compiled by them, says that although water comes from the highest place, it does not seek to rise above anything, and it operates with deep humility. And so, as someone who works for the university in these very institutionalized ways, I try to really remember that when we're here in this really great place. So I'm just very grateful that you're here today to have this conversation with us, and to everyone else for being here as well. And afterwards, if you want to go upstairs and look around or walk around, please feel free. And Danny, who's been living here, and myself, who works here, and Emma and many others who've been here a lot, are happy to show you around or tell you more.
Thank you so much, Astrida. Can people hear okay? Do I need to throw my voice more? That's okay. Astrida, thank you yes again just for welcoming us here. It is a special occasion because, of course, this is the second in our Storyteller series, and we are really privileged to have Professor Shawn Wilson with us today. Shawn, I know for many of you, requires absolutely no introduction other than to say that he is a wonderful scholar. He is a wonderful colleague. And it really is a huge privilege to have him here with us in the Okanagan at UBCO and here in Woodhaven with us right now. So thank you, Shawn, for being with us. Thank you, Astrida. And while I'm giving out thanks as well, I would really like to thank Harshita and Joe, I don't know where they are, who've laid on this beautiful spread of food, and the organization that they put into this has been remarkable. So thank you both so much. And also I'd like to quickly thank James and Sierra as well for acting as our media knowledge mobilization experts for the day. So it's super nice to have you here armed with phone cameras. Remember in the olden days when we used to have these huge, great big cameras? These are days of the past, Let me give you a little tiny bit of a background about the Storyteller series, because then I think it'll give context to some of the questions that we will be working our way through. So the Storyteller series was designed to sort of build on this other series that we have in the Institute for Community Engaged Research called Starting a Conversation. Starting a Conversation was all about allowing people to be able to have more sort of dialogue around the research that they're doing, and not just between graduate students, professors, but people often coming in from outside of the university. But then we realized that we weren't really doing justice to the incredible researchers that we actually have within the university. And so we thought, well, why don't we try and broaden it out and actually do some interviews with some of our really notable researchers. And of course, Shawn's name came up. The first one we did was with Dr. Leighton Schnellert, who, as many of you know, is a community-based researcher working in education. But then also we wanted to shake it up a bit and not just talk about research, but to think a little bit about life stories, about how people come to the point that they're at. What is it that sort of shapes the way that they think about things now, and how is that influenced by their past? Why is it that you decided to become an academic in the first place? Was it purely serendipitous, or was it some sort of intentional move from an early age? Oh, I must be an academic. I want to be dressed in the gown with a mortarboard. But I think that everybody has a very unique story. So when we have these well-established scholars like Dr. Wilson, I'm going to start calling you Shawn from now on, like Shawn. It is a wonderful opportunity, not just for you, but actually also for me as well, to really engage in a conversation about who are you as a human being, and how did you end up here, and what is your life story? And I think that people find that inspiring. But also, I think really importantly, within the university, there are many barriers. And the barriers around the hierarchies that we create, the barriers around graduate student versus faculty member versus undergraduate. There's so many different things which divide us. And so for us to sit down and have a frank discussion, I hope that what I'll do is to break down those barriers and humanize us all in this sort of process of dialogue. So that's where we're at right now. So I've got a bunch of questions here. But I would also like to say that if you have a question or a burning question, or if you feel that something hasn't been asked in the audience, please feel free also to ask a question as well. I'd ask you to just do it respectfully. So maybe just raise your hand, and then when there's a moment, then we can actually start to open the dialogue more broadly. Just while I'm doing a little bit of housekeeping as well, there is a washroom inside. If you go in upstairs through the door with the key code on the outside to the end on the right-hand side, there is a washroom there. Is there anything else that I need to think about in regards to housekeeping? Joe, am I good?
I think you're good.
I've covered everything. Okay, so without further ado, the first question for Shawn. So, reflecting on your journey, are there any sort of like special moments, particularly in your early life, that sparked your passion, or maybe that's too sort of profound a way of looking at it, steered you in the direction of research? And I think about research broadly, not, working at a university or being a professor or being, an author of a book, but actually research.
Yes. You asked a closed-ended question.
Okay. All right, should we go to number 2 then? And what were those moments?
Oh, man. Fuck, you start working in research design a lot, and it's... You realize just like how even we phrase things and phrase our conversations, and the way we put forward ideas really shapes the whole way that the responses are going to be, right? So it's like when you're thinking as a researcher, it's like, oh, did I ask that question well? And it's like, yeah, you did, because you gave like enough context around it. But I just being an asshole. Because you never know. Also, if the person that you're talking with is when you do research, is just messing with you, or if they're like
deadly serious,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, so it's kind of
or halfway between the two.
Yeah, or moving back and forth between them. So I'm trying to think. I was thinking of that, and it was like key moments, and I think that there are probably a couple, but kind of has been more or less a steady movement towards something rather than key pivotal points. I think one key pivotal, not a moment, but a time in my research journey was when I was, after I had my master's degree, I started teaching at Yukon College, what's now Yukon University, and an opportunity came up to go to Australia to teach a course there for one term. And so being young and single and unattached to any specific location at the time, it was easy for me to say, yeah, so I did. And that sort of, I think, opened up my horizons a lot more to looking at some of the similarities between Indigenous people not just in Western Canada and Western states and whatever, but to internationally, and looking at a lot of the similarities people have around the world. So that probably was I don't know if you call that a moment, but a sort of a key time that changed a lot of sort of how I looked at things.
So here we go. I'm going off script already, mate. So when you arrived in Australia, though, were you? I suppose, were you interested in this comparative thing, or were you interested in maybe sharing your experiences from, working in Western Canada, and then at what point did you transition into then thinking about, well, this is a really interesting comparison? And then I suppose ultimately I want to get to, is it the same, right? Like, are the sorts of things that you experienced in Australia the same as the sorts of experiences that you were having when you were in Western Canada?
Going backwards, yes.
Okay.
The similarities are really interesting, but a lot of it kind of depends on how you look at things. So a lot of the similarities are at the philosophical level and the sort of underlying reasons behind things level, but the way that they are enacted are incredibly context specific. So every culture and every Indigenous people have their own ways of acting and reacting and working with the land and the people on the land, and everything that goes into making up the land in their own specific way. But then when you start talking with people, you look at the reasons why they do things that way. It's quite often it's the same reasons why they're doing it that, but they have to do it specifically because it's context specific. Where were you before that one?
Okay, but then could you say that that's applicable then even outside of Western Canada and Australia? Have you seen this in
all over the place,
all sorts of contexts?
But it comes out in really strange ways too, because when I'm like, part of what I would have always been concerned with is also how I teach my kids, how my children are growing up and will grow up and continue to grow as being Cree people, but not necessarily living on Cree territory. So we're from a Pasquat, but the kids kind of have grown up in Australia. So what does that mean to be Indigenous but not on your own land? So part of that was also there was always a bunch of interlapping issues working together whenever you think about something. Part of that was that, bringing up my kids. But part of it is also how I go about working with elders, and especially with sacred knowledge and conducting ceremony and ceremonial type stuff. It's hard to explain what that really means, but the sort of sacred aspects of a lot of what I do in my personal life as well as my research. So I was talking about this with my dad, and he said, well, it's like all the same. It's just everything that we're doing is based on the land, and it's the same land between here and Australia. It's just a bit of water in between. So there's that underlying connection to the land, and that happened to be before I was going back to Australia for whatever reason. So I was talking to an elder down in Australia, like it would have been like within 2 or 3 weeks of talking with my dad about this, and they mentioned something about, like, oh, this is how we do it back in Canada, and asking about ceremony or whatever, and the elder said the exact same thing to me there. Well, it's all just based on the land, and it's just all, and it's the same land between here and there. There's just a bit of water in between. So it was kind of interesting and reassuring getting that same message from two elders, and like, basically on the opposite sides of the world, but saying, well, no, it's all just the land, and just a bit of water in between. So that, to me, that sort of reassured me, and also kind of reiterated the commonalities between Indigenous people. Yeah.
But then, okay, so to take us back a little bit there, so you did your master's degree. What was your master's degree in?
I did it in community psychology, and I did that at the University of Alaska.
Okay.
Fairbanks.
And then prior to that, your undergraduate degree?
In microbiology.
Oh my goodness! So you really have moved from the natural sciences through to Indigenous methodologies.
Yeah.
Okay, that's another whole series of different questions. I'm not going to ask you about that right now. But it is fascinating about how that trajectory took place. I mean, was that just serendipitous? Was it context? Was it I like. At what point is your current work influenced by some of the sort of early foundational training that you had?
Well, I think everything is related. I think in the beginning it was more kind of related in that I was working in opposition to, or not in opposition to, but in trying to more clearly delineate between the Western physical sciences and Indigenous science. But then the more I've got to know about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science, I've come to realize you don't need to work in opposition, or it's not a, well, now I'm going to say it's Indigenous science is like a bigger picture view, and Western science and Western knowledge is a subset of Indigenous science.
Rather than the other way around.
Yeah. So it allows me to incorporate a lot of that stuff that I learned in, like doing a Bachelor of Science. But that's still all relevant. It's just in a different context, and it's just part of what I know. But the Western system has these clear boundaries around it, whereas keep it within inside the box. Whereas the Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science has different sets of systems and structures around it that structure the knowledge that goes around the outside of. So we can do the Western science part, but we can also do the stuff that goes around that's outside of the boundaries of Western science. But we have a system for it.
But is that procedural? Is that just like the process by which you understand things? Or is it the details, or the specific details of understanding?
Both, I think. I would say it's kind of like, if you look at science as a system that underlies your knowledge, so that's what makes knowledge scientific, is the system behind it. There's system then for understanding, so it's the system, I guess.
Right.
So yeah, maybe that's not really procedural, but it's kind of how to explain that any better?
Foundation.
Yeah, foundational. Yeah.
Fascinating. Actually, this morning I heard on the radio there was an interview being done with a lady from one of the Eastern First Nations, and they were talking about this whatever they call it, whatever the eclipse that was occurring. And she is an astrophysicist, but she has returned back to her elders to discover how eclipses in particular were understood in the past. And she ended up with this conclusion, in fact, that many of her ancestors were in fact physicists. They were, they had an intrinsic knowledge of celestial bodies and how celestial bodies actually related to each other. And of course, now in astrophysics, this is exactly the sort of thing that they're beginning to discuss, but it's been known to, to her community for generations.
Yeah. For certain aspects of community, it's just like, Western science has specialists. We've also had specialists in our Indigenous sciences that would know or study or, know about specific areas of Indigenous knowledge. You don't have to know like everything. And so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move on to question number 2. So because we're the Institute for Community Engaged Research, so Community Engaged Research is a term that means different things to different people. So could you maybe just explain briefly about, you've already mentioned the word community numerous times right now. So for you, what sort of encapsulates, I suppose, the endeavor of community engaged research?
Yeah, I was reading that and I was like, well, it kind of depends on how you define community. So that was one thing that was a big part of like my master's degree in community psychology, was coming to an understanding that there's lots of different types of community, and not creating this sort of monolithic sort of idea of what community is to me is really important. Part of understanding community engagement. Because, well, especially if you're, say, talking about Indigenous people, and you can pick any Indigenous community if you speak geographically, and there's going to be such tremendous variety and infighting and all this sort of stuff within that community. You can't say that there's going to be one voice that speaks for this geographic community. But if you think of community in different ways, it's like, could be a community of interest, or it could be like we here are now like a little community that, when you start thinking of community in different ways, it really shapes differently how you're going to engage with that community. So a lot of the time now I think of community as a community of interest. So these are the people that share this interest in whatever thing it is that you're going to be talking about. And that community may be formed deliberately, or that community may just be serendipity, or who knows why that community forms the way that it does. But starting to think about how I engage with community as being more in that sense. So not worrying so much about the wider geographic, or not defining community so much geographically, as more around points of interest, because the geography includes too much breadth and too much variance within.
So how does that affect your research though? When you mentioned already, hey, I work in community, of my community. You fall into that trap a few
how
times
I would
already.
define my community then is the community of Indigenous scholars. So most of the work that I do is like supervising people or helping them design their research projects. So that the community I choose to work with is the community of Indigenous scholars. Just because that's where I sort of have a skill set that I could be useful. So, well, that's one way. That's the main community I work with. And then that community is not geographically centered either. It's like, yeah, right now I'm working with mostly students here in the Okanagan, but still got students all over the place. And but then also it's like meeting with people. Like this past couple of months, I've been working with Indigenous people all over the world, really, trying to. So it's kind of like a community of scholars.
Okay, I'm going to go completely off script again. Do we need to police the boundary of community? And I think about this, so let me finish. So say, for example, if you've got somebody in a different faculty that's developing a new form of internal combustion engine, and they happen to be working with a local industry to support them. Is that community?
Yeah.
Does that fit within community engaged research?
I would think so.
Okay,
well, to me, it more depends on the protocols of how. What does engagement mean? Maybe is a better thing.
Oh, okay, all right, for sure. Now I got. Okay, so but you were the one who went down the community path. So what does engagement mean in the context of community?
Well, if I start to think, then it really depends on how you view community dynamics, right? So if you are engaging, if you have a community and you view the community as a group of peers or a group of people that, or not doesn't necessarily just include people. Don't have the right words. If a group of agental entities,
Exactly.
A group of things that are all interested in a particular topic or whatever it is that you're engaging with them about, then how you view the relationships between all of those entities is going to shape how you interact and engage with it, right? So if you're viewing things in a very egalitarian way, you're going to engage with everyone equally, and people's voices all come out the same, and people interact in a different way than if you have a very hierarchical view of community. Then you're going to engage them in a totally different way.
Okay.
So it's like, if I think that I'm the expert on whatever it is that we're going to engage with, then my form of engagement is just telling you what I'm going to do,
Right.
which totally doesn't. It's one-way interaction with people at the bottom of the hierarchy, because their point of view doesn't really matter that much, but it is a form of engagement. It's just a one-way engagement.
Okay, all right. So now there is no community. There is no engagement.
Well, there is community.
There is community, but it's not
It's
not
define it a
centered.
little bit differently.
It's not bounded.
Yeah.
Okay, is there research? Here we go. So let's take the last word to task here as well.
No, there's not. Yeah, there is. I would say it's all around the structure of how you structure your knowledge again. So there's systems around how you structure knowledge, but the community, however you define community, and the way that you engage with entities within that community is going to also impact on how knowledge is engaged with. In other words, knowledge is interacted with in the relationship. So knowledge can be something that is seen as something that's like purely abstract, purely out there, and that is something that you go and discover. so that, you know, I can go and discover that knowledge individually, or we as a group can go and discover knowledge. It's that very sort of colonial attitude of
Like fruit on the tree.
yeah, it's fruit on a tree, you go and pick
Yeah,
it, then you own it for yourself. Or another way of viewing it is that, like, knowledge is something that coexists with the land. So it becomes an active, maybe it's like sitting here in this chair with us, it becomes an active participant in our form of engagement. So we can have ways of inviting knowledge into whatever we're doing that honors and gives it a safe space to emerge. So it's not then something that we own, but it's something that comes to all of us then as a deeper understanding of how we can interact with the world in a better way.
So different from how we in the university understand knowledge. By knowledge, you need to be able to put a name to knowledge, and that name will be associated with that knowledge for time immemorial, right? And the more times that people mutter, you know, that relationship through citation, then the more important you become. Super important. It actually brings me on quite nicely to the next question. So in your book, Research is Ceremony, you talk a lot about the relational side of research, particularly in Indigenous contexts. So could you think a little bit about how this whole piece around relationality interfaces or aligns with Western research paradigms? And I'm going to leave, and I was going to say earlier, and how does it relate to community engaged research? But we dissed that so much, we're just going to leave that behind us now.
I don't think we've dissed community engaged research. I think we've supported it,
We've
but
unpacked it.
It's like we don't, and I think that's an important thing. You can't just necessarily accept that this is community engaged research, because then it becomes dogmatic and paradigmatic.
Yeah.
That you have to do it this way or that way. But if you understand how are we defining community? How are we defining engagement? And how are we defining research? Then we can undertake community engaged research in a way that's beneficial for however you define community. It's beneficial for however you define engagement. It's beneficial for however you define research, rather than just sort of
taking a whole bunch of words,
Yeah.
like word salad, and assuming that it is something that it might not be. I absolutely agree with that.
So I'm not dissing it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying understand it.
But okay, so going back though to this, in thinking
yeah.
specifically about relationality and Western paradigms of knowing, including community engaged research.
Yeah.
What is the relationship? Do they align? Are they so very invariant in their current settings that perhaps
In the
never the twain shall meet?
No, I think that again it's a subset. So the Western science part, I think, again, is a subset, but it doesn't recognize necessarily. It's like the Indigenous science part recognizes the Western science, but the Western science doesn't necessarily recognize the Indigenous science. So it's a bit of a catch-22, and because I think that, you know, the Western system, the way it's built around hierarchy, ends up excluding so many people from the Western knowledge production system.
Even within its own, its own realm,
right. It's like it excludes women right off the bat. So there's like half the men, excludes anyone that's not cisgendered male. So I mean, it's like counting out less than half. More than half the people is out that way already, and then it excludes poor people, and it excludes all these other people. So it's like really Western science only works for like a small percentage of the people.
And within that, even there's this like pyramidal hierarchical system where a few are rarefied and the rest are like, you know, detritus.
So it's like, for me, it's not the best system. Because it discounts the knowledge that all of those other people have.
So what about the relationality side?
So the relationality part of it is like deliberately including all of those other voices. So sometimes we will include the voices of the heteropatriarchal system, and their voice counts sometimes too. But we also have to include all the other voices. So Right now, I think it's way easier to do research and to publish stuff that includes other voices than it was, say, 30 years ago. Say, when I did my master's degree, I had to struggle really hard to use the first person in my thesis. I had to write a justification for why I was using qualitative research methods instead of quantitative research methods. So when you look at how much research landscape has changed in the last 30 years, it's really, really opened up. So it includes way more people, includes way more voices, includes way more knowledge and forms of knowledge transmission that never used to be classified as science, but now they are. So it's like that Western science boundaries are opening up. I think that those will continue to open further the more we go along. So it's just a matter of, for us, I think that are working on those borders or those boundaries of where things work is always sort of just like occupying that any space that's sort of ambiguous as let's occupy that space and let's use it. And so just keep pushing those boundaries up further and further out. It just creates more room and more space for more and more people. But we can still like go inside there to write a paper that's going to meet the demands of the Western system, but then let's use that voice also to push out whenever we can as we working on the boundaries.
But do you think this whole relationality thing is always going to be sort of peripheralized in the sense that it's always going to be this slightly fringe, sort of element to research that needs to constantly justify itself and, and write, explanations about why they want to use the first person or why qualitative science?
No. Yeah, that's really hard to know. It's the trajectory I'm seeing, it's becoming more and more and more common. So it's hopefully it just keeps going that way. It becomes more mainstreamized, although I want it to be mainstream.
I think
sometimes things go.
Yeah, well, I think in the current climate, it's kind of a little bit uncertain for sure. But I would wonder as well. That it might be sort of slightly peripheralized. But I do think that this whole idea about the significance of relationships and giving, or amplifying voices that have less, that less airtime is super important to community engaged research. And maybe it's foundational, but at the same time, when you're writing about it, and I'm sure you'll probably disagree with me here, it's become embedded within Indigenous methodologies. And so I suppose what I'm thinking about here is, where is the bridge between community engaged research, which doesn't define itself within Indigenous contexts, and the work in research and ceremony, which is specifically within Indigenous contexts? Like, do we see an alignment there or a bridge there? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I think there is a big alignment because a lot of the people I think that do community engaged research are sort of defining community how I went back and defined it. They are engagement, defining engagement the way we went back and unpacked it, and researchers for that matter. So I think that probably most of the people that do what we would call community engaged research are probably doing something very similar to Indigenous research. So actually rephrasing that and rephrasing it as Indigenous research rather than Indigenous. So framing it as a paradigm or a philosophical foundation that guides the way you do research, rather than, it's not like a racial thing.
I agree.
So the analogy is, it's like I'm a feminist, but I'm not female. It can be a man and be a feminist. So I would think that you can be an Indigenous philosopher and follow Indigenous rules and how you do community engaged research. You don't have to be Indigenous genetically to do it. It's more around
it's
the rules.
Not appropriation.
If you follow the guidelines, it's not. That's the problem, is if you sort of say, oh yeah, I'm going to do Indigenous research, but then you don't follow it, but then you just impose a bunch of Western rules on it. Then you're not doing Indigenous research, you're doing appropriation.
Right.
When you're saying that, yeah, I'm going to do Indigenous research, but part of that is like amplifying its Indigenous voice, and part of that is the reciprocity, and part of that is understanding that I need to do these things. Then it's like, yeah, then do it. Then it's not appropriation anymore. Then it's like speaking and amplifying the voice of the community.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to put it out to the audience more broadly, and then we'll come back and do some other questions. But I want to think a little bit more about this relational accountability, because often we frame it as, and I suppose this comes back to your sort of the broad umbrella of an indigenous approach. But I want us to bring us back to thinking about the relationships also that we develop with not just our research partners that often exist outside of the realm of the university, but to think about the relationships with people within the university. So how are relationships important with, you've already marked it with your own children, but with your graduate students, with your colleagues, with the staff, and with the university administration, like those different levels. How important is a relational approach to addressing all of those different actors that we butt into every day? Is it relevant, or does it only exist in the realm of research?
No, I was just thinking the other way around. It's like, how would you not have it incorporated into everything? It's like, because it's the fundamental nature of my ontology, that the whole universe is made up of relationships. It's the relationships that make the universe is what it is. And then nothing can be outside of relationship. So it's kind of a foreign way to think about how good would it.
So then is it reductive to even call it a methodology?
Potentially, yeah.
It's just a way of being.
Well, it's a way of being, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose you can adapt that way of being into, like, how am I going to use this way of being to find out knowledge or to build a knowledge base? Then it becomes a methodology, I think. But it's not just a methodology, it's a whole.
But it is interesting because certainly, if you think about it, your book is defined as an indigenous methodology, and that's how it's cited often. And, it's like all about relationships, and people have taken parts of it and turned it into something. But I was just thinking more broadly about how, in fact, it is a really important way to go about life, just generally, and it should in fact impact every relationship that you have.
Well, everything that you do. So if you think about, if that's the foundation of your ontology or your understanding of the universe, is that everything that is that way because of relationships. It's in relationship with everything else around it. So if the entire universe is a series of relationships, then how you behave in relationship changes the fundamental nature of the universe. So it puts a lot more pressure on us to behave ourselves properly, but it also comes with a great potential. Then if I am behaving myself and acting out of a place of love, then it makes the whole universe a more loving place. So it's, it's got its downside. It's like a lot more pressure to act burn to love, but there's also the upside that if I do, it's going to make the whole universe a better place.
Well, there's a whole suitcase full of stuff we could unpack there. Let's turn it out to the audience for some other questions. Any questions for Shawn? We've touched on community engaged research. Okay. Alrighty, here we go.
No, you go. Oh, that was just so amazing to listen to, and I loved Shawn, when you were responding to John about the question of community, and you spoke about my community's community of interests, and I'm really thinking about that because one thing I think I've been trying to think about in terms of community is how it also includes beings or people who I may not share interests with. And that's part of my work, right? And so I wonder how you think about community in that way, like as inclusive of people who don't necessarily share my interests or my objectives or my aims. And
that's the hard part. It's kind of like a catch-22, right? If you are inclusive of everyone's voice, you also have to include the voice of the assholes, which is really hard. Because it's like, there's a lot of stuff that's happening like just thinking at the moment about a lot of the stuff that's happening around transgendered people's rights, and how there's a big backlash and a lot of hatred towards trans people, which I just totally don't understand. But it's, for me, the immediate backlash is to be fighting those people, because it's just fucked up. but at the same time, I kind of know that that's not going to work because
Then we just become further and further apart.
yeah.
We never speak
So
to each other.
how can I incorporate those people that I think are idiots in a loving way that will help to change things to make things better? And that's like really hard, and I don't know. So I don't know how to. I just acknowledge that's a really big problem, but I really don't know how to fix it.
This kind of intersects with that a little because, I was thinking as we're talking through relationality, and I was thinking of the, because I sort of think of research in a way as an activism as well. And I was thinking about how, the corporate world, the extractivist world, relies on relations. It is a form of relationality. It's certain types of sectors that get supported, it's certain types of people that get phoned up, that get lobbied, that benefit, and so on. And then the consequences of repair and so on that come from certain actions. And so it wasn't until right at the end that I wondered if what your version of relationality actually pivots on love. And that word in itself is a really interesting one then to unpack what that actually means. And in relation to communities of difference, and who you sort of bring in or try and create a barrier toward, how you activate love in that context. A little bit folded.
yeah, no, I totally know what you mean, and it's hard too because it's to me the part of the relationality and understanding that is also understanding that the flip side of it is that it comes with accountability. Then, so if you can change the nature of the universe by how you behave in relationships, then you realize that you've got a lot of responsibility that comes with that. So every relationship that you build or become more conscious of or deliberately enhance or in whatever will come with new sets of responsibilities as well. So if we're doing research into trans rights, that comes with a whole bunch more responsibilities of ensuring that that research is used in appropriate ways. Or if we're doing research into like the fire, then that's also going to come with a different set of responsibilities that become accountable for ensuring that fire is used appropriately. So that accountability part to me is the big aspect of it, and how that, like, what is ensuring that you act out of love. So when you're working with a community, then you become also accountable to that community. So it's like, how do you ensure that, how does the community know that you're acting in a loving way? To me, it is a really important question.
Just through your actions, your words.
Yeah.
And I
And
suppose
it's
what you
not
do with your
something
research
easy,
results.
yeah. And it's not something that happens like in like a minute or a week or a year. It's like, that's when you know that the community really accepts you. It's like when it's like, oh yeah, we've seen you doing this for the last 20 years. Yeah, we trust you.
Yeah.
Even though sometimes you make mistakes, that we trust you, that you're still acting with a good heart, and that you'll atone for your mistakes, or maybe I don't understand why you did that, so I might see it as a mistake, but you had some other reason for doing it. So those things change.
Just a quick question. How do you, when we talk about communities of interest, there are communities that are, people that they don't realize that they have an interest in. So how can we develop or encourage people to see that there is an interest in something that they are not interested in?
That's really hard, isn't it? Like that. I mean, I think that's the hardest work that I'm doing right now. I find it really easy working with different Indigenous communities because usually they've invited me to be there or built up relationship and stuff. I think the harder work that I'm doing right now is working with, I don't even know how to phrase it, but like the industrial complex of trying to make them understand that what they're doing is killing the planet and trying to get them working in different ways. And basically trying them to think a little bit more indigenously. That makes sense. So that they will behave themselves better. And that's really, really hard. I think that most people that I've talked with understand that there's a fundamental problem with the status quo, but they also are deeply embedded with and benefit from the status quo. So that it's not necessarily in their personal best interest in the short term to change things because they're benefiting from it. But it's like this sort of whole neoliberal capitalist system and sort of the way modern democracy works too are all intricately tied with taking agency away from the land and actually destroying the land. So how can we get people to recognize it's in their own best interest in the long term to change the whole system? And I really don't know how to do that either. That's something that that's the hardest work that I'm working on right now and trying to change that. But it's kind of like, I can't tell if anyone's listening or if anyone's actually changing the way they behave, other than they keep asking me to talk at things. So I'm assuming it at least solves their conscience a little bit to think about stuff. But I don't know if they're actually making changes.
Okay, I'm going to move us now away from the theoretical, and I'm going to start to bring us into the pragmatic, the applied. And I suppose there's a couple of different ways here that I want to approach this. One is just thinking a little bit about the impact of research on you. Is there any particular story, because this is the Storyteller series, any particular story that you would like to share where you fundamentally learned from the community that you were actually working with?
I learn from it all the time. Again, it's one of those things that it's like a continual learning and hopefully continual growth, not much backsliding. That's what's hard to pick out an individual thing. I think for one, like a big project that I'm working on right now is looking at Indigenous star knowledge. So this kind of ties in with the whole story. So how far back to take the story? Because there's there's maybe like 3 or 4 different story threads interact. Back in 2018, I want to say, I can't remember what exactly it was. One of the elders from my community, Wilfred Buck, was working with David Plandon at the Canadian Natural Museum of Science and something or other. So they were working with an astronomy project, looking at Indigenous astronomy, because they had a not a display, but like a thing at the museum at that time that was exploring astronomy. So Wilfred, part of what he does is goes around to different Cree communities and tells our star stories and helps to keep those star stories alive. So he was asked me 2 different things. One was, as part of this series that they're doing with the museum, was to help connect with Aboriginal Australian people that might want to come and tell their star stories. 2 was to look at the research methods behind what they're doing. So he said, we have all these stories, and from these stories we know a lot of this astronomical information about the way the stars move and planets move and all this sort of stuff. We said, how did we find that stuff? What were the research methods behind Indigenous astronomy? Because he knew the stories, but he didn't know how the stories originated. So those were two pretty cool questions for me. and I felt very honored that he would ask me about that. So I was working at Southern Cross University in Australia at the time. So I talked with a friend of mine there, Stuart Barlow, to get him started to think about this, and we started thinking about it. And actually, here's where it's like there's interlocking threads back. Stuart and I were in Ottawa like a couple of weeks before that, presenting at a conference in digital conference about digitizing Indigenous knowledge and how that's going to work, and how Indigenous knowledge can work in online spaces and blah, blah, blah. So it was at that conference that I met with David, who was working at the museum. He said, oh, I've been talking with Wilfred and we've been trying to get in touch with you. So it was like, anyway, it was like interlocking things here. But I talked with Stuart about, all right, this was, because he also was part of that conversation with David. So I talked with Stuart later about, this is what Wilfred wants. So can you help me out with this? Because Stuart's Aboriginal Australian, he's Ewan. And he said, ooh, that sounds like, he got really excited and interested in the project too, because it sounds like really cool. And both of us are, like, that's the sort of stuff we like finding out about. So he then had to phone his elders to sort of ask for permission from his elders, and also to ask for his elders, like, how do we get started on this? So his elder said, well, we can't really talk about that on the phone. So a van full of elders from his community drove north, and he drove south of it, because it's like about, I don't know, 800 kilometers apart, like 10 hours drive. So they kind of met in the middle there somewhere, and they had this meeting for a couple of days. And part of it, the outcome of the meeting was, we can't start working on this yet, because in order to hear star stories, you have to be initiated as a youth. And in order to tell star stories, you have to be initiated as an elder. And they lost their initiation ceremonies through the process of colonization. So they restarted their initiation ceremonies and initiated. And so we went back home, and so Stuart had to get prepared. And I was helping him talk about. So they then said, all right, so we are going to initiate you as our first community elder that we've had for who knows long.
Stuart.
Yeah. So I was helping Stuart prepare to, like, all right, well, I don't know about how initiation ceremonies work there, but I know how initiation ceremonies work in my community, and this is what some of the things you may want to know about, and these blah, blah, blah. So Stuart went down and became initiated as an elder in his community. So that's the first time they'd initiated elders for a long time. So they had to sort of recreate the ceremony of how to become initiated. But a part of that ceremony, they initiated him with a specific purpose of helping to revitalize the star stories in their community. So he was given a ceremonial object that's kind of like a passport amongst Indigenous Australian communities, that if he presents that object to elders in other communities, they will know that he has the sort of blessing of elders in his home community to go there for a specific purpose of talking about star stories and helping the other communities to decide, all right, these are the star stories that we're willing to share so that you can use in your community as well. So that's his job now as an elder, is to go out to different communities and collect star stories and bring them back for his community. So that's happening in one area. So at the same time, we were living in Bunjalung country. So
Also in Australia.
yeah. So like, if you imagine Australia, Bunjalung country's here, Ewan country's down here, like 800 kilometers apart, and I'm like way over here in Canada. But we're working on their territory, so we had to also talk with the elders there. So we talked with a couple of elders and saying, this is what we're going to be doing. And it sort of set off a whole thing there too. But one of the senior elders that we were working with was, I wouldn't have a clue how old he is. But one of the elders passed away, unfortunately, but another one I'll be meeting with in a couple of weeks. he was remembering when he was supposed to be initiated as a young man. So he was like 11, 12, 13. That was the year that all of the elders in the local nation had a meeting and decided it was too dangerous for them to carry on doing their initiation ceremonies. So they burnt a lot of their ceremonial stuff, and they stopped doing initiations then. So he can remember that. And we were trying to figure out afterwards the date, and it was in the 1950s, early 1950s around then. So he's like, I don't know, that makes 80 something.
80,
Yeah.
right?
So of course he was going through a bit of a grieving process, just talking about this, right? And then talking with other elders in the community, and just telling them that what we were doing, we weren't necessarily doing it for this community, but it's like we're doing it for you and for Cree, but we're working out of your territory, so you have to know what's going on. But they also got really interested in it, and it's like, oh man, it's them starting to realize some of the star stories that they still held, and some of this, but what they were missing also. So we kind of left it there, and we're working. That's like over a couple of years, right? A year later, we got invited down to this meeting in the next community. Like it's still like the far southern end of Bunjalung territory, which is quite a ways down. Invited us to come and do a presentation there and talk to them. So we didn't know any of this was happening, but in the background, all of the elders, of course, are talking across all of the whole state. And so they wanted us to come and help them. So we found out that the 7 nations that are part of the east coast of Australia, every once in a while used to hold initiation ceremonies together as like a big thingo. So they wanted us to come together to help them to revitalize their initiation ceremonies across the whole region. I was like, holy shit. So it was like turned into this big thing. So all this was supposed to happen, and then COVID hit.
Oh my God.
So it's like, oh, got put on pause. And it's like, so this is just kind of waiting in the background. This is kind of, I think, all going to start kicking off again as people re-emerge from the COVID, of revitalizing all of the initiation ceremonies for the young people around.
Just for the star stories, or
Well,
broader than that?
Well, it's broader than that, because it's like the transmission of knowledge then. Because the knowledge comes with obligations, it's like you become initiated, puts you to the next level of you are now ready to hear different types of knowledge, because you have acknowledged that you're going to take on a new level of responsibility as well.
Right.
So it's like,
Man,
so
hey,
it's like,
the power of research there, eh? Or
Yeah.
the researchers anyway.
but that isn't even the end of it. So
Okay, come on.
while we're doing this, so we also we're still looking for the elders, right, that we're going to come and tell the stories. So we're working with the community up in far north Queensland. So we started working with the community up there, Wudjil. Again, we went there, visited with them, and they're like, yeah, we'll come back, we'll talk about it. But then COVID hit, right? So we couldn't go back for a couple of years because the community closed. Like their way of dealing with COVID was to just totally quarantine themselves and no outsiders in the community. So we went back there 2 years ago, finally, and just spent the 2 weeks just hanging out, chopping firewood and doing whatever. And that was okay. We'll see you around. Then we went back again the following year, which was last year, and then spent another week like chopping firewood and hanging out and just doing whatever. And then when we left last time, they said, "All right, yeah, we'll work with you." So it took that a couple of years to just sort of them to get to know us and to recognize what we could do. But they said, but part of what our initiation ceremonies aren't going well here either, because there's a big disconnect between the youth and the elders. So the research project that we're going to do with them is to train young people in how to use video technology and how to edit, so that they are going to record the elders' stories and make little documentaries for each of the elders that tells their story as a way of method for connecting the youth with the elders.
So, and how do you fit into this? As a researcher, or as a facilitator, or as a...
Yeah, well, I don't know. Yeah, that's the research, but it's like I don't know how I fit in. It's I'd like to. You just facilitate things, and they just let them take a life of their own, and you just start. How can I help them?
Okay, here we go. Like, this is the last question on this before I move on to my last question. But how do you write about that in an honest way?
Shit, I don't know.
Do you write about this? Like,
Yeah.
is it something? I mean, okay, so it comes back to relationships and trust, right? It's like, and we build up trust and we develop relationships, and these relationships aren't about writing research articles or writing research books. They're relational. They're like, hey, let's sit down and by the fire together, and have a chit chat. How's the family doing, and all the rest of it, right? I mean, you could accuse us of being completely disingenuous, or fake. Hey, we're just doing it to get the research paper out of here to elevate our own careers. So the question for you: how do you write about these like deeply sensitive but yet profoundly important, research projects?
I don't know. I'll let you know when I figure it out.
Okay, how have you done it in the past? Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, you write about things that are on the periphery. Really, is what it ends up, because you can't write about the deeply personal, sort of sacred ideas that we're sharing. So instead, sort of write it on the periphery.
I'm going to remember that one for sure. That's beautiful. Okay, my final question. You've obviously accrued so much experience. I use the word wisdom here, but I'm sure you wouldn't want me to use that word. And so in hindsight, when you look back on what you have achieved, the projects you've been involved with over the last decades, what would you want to tell all the young people sat around in this circle right now? Young, old, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, who maybe are just starting off, embarking on their work with communities, with Indigenous groups. What advice would you give them?
You don't have to do everything all at once. You're going to write about this much in your thesis, you're going to learn this much. So just remember what the purpose of your thesis is to get your damn degree. You don't have to write everything there is that you learned in your thesis.
Right around the periphery, right?
Yeah. But that's I think a big problem that I really witness a lot. Doesn't happen as much with grad students, but very much with undergraduate students, is especially with like climate anxiety, and just I think younger people recognize how fucked up our system is a lot more than older people do, so they are really anxious about what they should be. So I think a lot of the time I'm trying to encourage people to take like a longer view of things, and it's like you don't have to fix everything yourself, and if you start to think about things instead of what you're going to do, say like in the next 6 months or the next year, start to think about something more like 1,000 year plan of, what's my 1,000 year plan, what do I want to happen in 1,000 years. When you do that, you recognize that you don't have to do it all yourself, for one thing. All you have to do is start taking a few steps in the right direction, and then you get a few people around you stepping in the right direction, and that will make the bigger change. It's around changing the processes of how we engage with each other, rather than having a specific goal that I have to get there. It's like, let's get everyone walking in the same direction as our goal, rather than necessarily knowing specifically where you're going to go. So hopefully that helps people deal with some of that anxiety a little bit. Is even though I don't have to get everything done in my master's degree or my PhD, or even in the course of my lifetime, all I need to do is shoot people on a little bit.
Move in the right direction. Set an example. I have to say I've been so impressed by all of the grad students here who seem just to have been so intentional around doing precisely that, effectively working together, strategizing together, being really effective. So super. Hey, so open it up. More questions. Yes.
Your question about what do you write about when you engage in work with community brought up something to my mind. The very much colonial institutional ethical requirements, and how they tend to get in the way when one wants to engage in more relational sort of inquiry, which is more organic in my experience, right? and you got tick boxes and prescribe what's gonna happen and the outcomes. What are your thoughts about that? Do you see any hope for change happening in that system? How do you work with or around that?
Well, the whole ethics thing is totally like, I mean, the fact that we have ethics now is a big change from 40 years ago when we didn't, and people used to go into indigenous communities and just data mine and meaning mine, right? So the fact that we have ethics is a really good thing. But I think there's been a bit of a pendulum switch that makes it like really hard for indigenous people to work in their own communities. So it's kind of, I don't know, sometimes some sort of happy medium. Again, it's part of that thing of occupying any space that's kind of like ambiguous, and it's kind of like, I'm not going to ask for ethics approval for that, sorry. Just going and doing it. Because it's like, well, I don't know if I technically need ethics for this, so I'm not going to ask for approval. Like, I'm not going to ask for approval to go and interview my father to get some knowledge from him. Because it's like, no, you don't have the right to refuse me. Because if you're asking for approval for someone, you're also giving them the right to refuse approval, right?
Yeah.
I have especially on advisors who are working within the interest communities, and you know, this kind of the line is very
Yeah, that's hard, and I think especially it depends if they're working in their own community. If I have to give a lot more leeway to students that are working in their own community because they know their community, so it's like, do you think we need to do? What do you think we need to do? But it's much more difficult if a student from outside is working in a different community. Then I would expect a lot more thought put into it. Not. I think there's always thought put into it, but a lot more procedure, explanation about why you're doing things. So it's not necessarily having to justify what you're doing, but explaining what exactly you're doing.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Thank you, Shawn, for your talk. I think this is really interesting because I've been reading your book recently, and so to kind of hear you speak and have read your reading is really nice to see kind of both of that. I was really curious because you have within Research and Ceremony this, like, I think it's in italics, but separate sections of the text that are addressed to your sons. So I was really curious, like, about how you came to that, of figuring out, like, it's a bit of a, I don't know, a bit of an unconventional way of doing it. So I was curious how you came to that idea and like why you did that and like what it helped you do with your research.
Well, I don't think I would have been able to finish my PhD if I didn't do things differently, because I was kind of at the stage where I'd done all of the fieldwork part of it, and I was just writing it up, and it was so hard, and it was just struggling with how to express myself in ways that were going to be understood in a Western context. So my wife Helen had said to, now I was getting really frustrated with this, wasting a lot of time. And Helen was like, "Why are you even bothering? What are you doing this for?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing it for our kids, really." And she said, "Well, why don't you write it to them?" So that sort of set me on the path of, yeah, well, I'll just pretend I'm writing for them. So instead of just pretending, I just actually did it. But then I started also to see other people that were doing that in their writing. So different styles. There started to be a style of writing that was, rather than having this sort of academic narrative that runs just like, meh, a lot of people were doing sort of more writing that was more akin to film scripts, where it's like you're jumping from this scene and you jump to another scene. That creates a whole different dynamic in how the writing works. And then I was starting to see, I think it was in the Handbook of Qualitative Inquiry, the first one that came out. It was at Ellison Bachner. Do you remember? Like, they're always at the ICQI. But anyway, one of the article that they had in that handbook was written as a conversation between the two of them, and I thought, holy shit, is this ever good? Because they were talking about research ones to find interesting anyway, but it's kind of like the way that they use dialogue as a way of expressing ideas, I thought was brilliant. And I thought, well, I'm not necessarily going to write something as a dialogue, but recognize from the way other people are doing things that I can change my voice and have it sort of addressing different audiences. So it was like addressing two different audiences. But then as it progress went along, recognizing that my own personal development meant that I was addressing this audience and this audience separately at the beginning. But hopefully as I was going along, they became to sort of more like one voice, where I think that was part of like a personal journey as well.
That's really
Finding my own
impressive.
voice.
I like the dialogical aspect of it. It's sparking some ideas for me.
Can I say that I'm super grateful you said that, Shawn, because there are a number of students who are in my qualitative research class who are here today, and some of them were like super creative. And you know, it seems to me that that's what the question that John was asking about bridging across Indigenous, community-based and community-engaged research story, but also qualitative research, qualitative inquiry. That's why the ICQI has been an interesting place to go to every year, because there's bridges or conversations across. And so one of the things that I found the most challenging at UBCO is to convince students that it's okay to do all this stuff. Because most of the time in my classes, unless I get a super creative adventurous group of students like last year, and some of them are here, and it was such pleasure, because it's like my job is to give them permission to try to do it. And sometimes they don't give them, even if I do that, there's still this kind of, and it comes from the colonial mindset of the university, right? That you can't possibly enjoy doing research, and relationality is also about connections between people and having some, not just trust, but also some, I think you talked about ceremony of learning that has some joy in it as well. And when you start talking about stuff like that in university, people are like, what? Joy? Or you said love even. So I'm so glad that you're mentioning all this, because it's also a way of legitimizing it, you know, for people in general, like us, all of us, whatever methodologies we're using and so on, to be able to open some possibilities that seem not necessarily encouraged because of the quantitative methodologies that everybody's working with and everybody's familiar with. But qualitative research has so many opportunities to try and have conversations across Indigenous scholars, non-Indigenous scholars, artists, arts-based research, community members, cultural knowledge keepers, so on, that can be done qualitatively in a respectful way if we try it in a different way than the university wants us to do it, right? Usually.
Or it's that we assume the university
Yes,
wants us to do
exactly.
that, but sometimes it's just our own.
Exactly, that's what I'm telling
assumptions.
students, but I think it's so ingrained
Yeah.
that it's really a challenge sometimes to open that up in a way that feels doable, productive, that is going to lead somewhere. But you know, the idea that we don't know where research is going is kind of part of the whole process of qualitative research, that we're open to that.
Yeah.
We're not looking for a result, and we don't have this outcome, and you know. So thank you for saying that, because I think that we need to hear more often people like yourself who really have established themselves within the field, give students a sense that, you know, the reason why you're doing that and the reason why we're trying to do that is to enable others to think of their own ways of doing it, right?
Yeah. And think of all different ways of, like, really all we're trying to do is allow other people to understand some of the knowledge that we're working with. And you can understand knowledge in a lot of different ways. It's like embodied knowledge, or it's like purely academic knowledge, or it's purely abstract, or whatever. But to help someone to understand embodied knowledge, you can talk to your blue in the face, it's not going to make a difference. But if you provide someone with an experience, suddenly they may understand it.
Yeah.
Or you sing a song, or you have a poem, or you have a whatever that may speak to them in a way that the purely abstract Western writing doesn't.
I found this idea that you mentioned about occupied spaces, like almost surreptitiously, like pushing boundaries. So I was wondering if you have found yourself needing to change spaces, because some of the spaces you occupy become too obvious, and maybe yeah, not
Probably changing spaces all the time, but really most often not getting pushback. And it's like that ambiguous space is ambiguous because no one knows what the hell's going on. So if you occupy it, everyone assumes that you're allowed to be there. And then, so they don't care, they don't know what any different. So it's like, oh yeah, okay, those guys belong there.
Yeah. Act like you own it, eh?
Yeah. I was thinking like that one time at the Congress of Qualitative Inquiry. We were there. I think the best time I've ever had at a conference was one night we just kind of went into where the coffee shop area was and took over the stage and just had like a open mic sort of night where we just storytelling. We just went up and everyone had to go up and either tell a story or do a song or whatever. And it was just like, that was the best fun I've ever had at a conference ever. And it was just because we went and just took over the space.
Yeah. Unconference. Anti-conference.
Come to the what is it called? The International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry. I mean, that's just a reminder that that's a really interesting conference that's super international, incredibly interdisciplinary. But it has a group called the Indigenous Inquiry Circle. That's how I got to know Shawn, because of that circle, and it's a really, really great place to kind of become aware of. It's quite inclusive. Like if you offer to be part of it, the vetting process is a lot more inclusive than other conferences, and there's more possibilities to be creative as well and to experiment. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, they're really open to experimental methodologies.
Yep.
And experimental ways of transmitting knowledge. That's cool. So I think me and Lindsay and Noah and Geraldine are all going to be presenting.
That's
at this
wonderful.
Yeah. Hey, if we don't have any more questions, I am going to thank Shawn for such a wonderful set of answers to my somewhat benign questions. Thank you all for being here today. Really, what a pleasure. We will work at trying to take the material and turn it into a video, which we will then ultimately put up on the ICER website and share with all of you. I would encourage you to go and eat some of the delicious food that Joe has cooked, and sit around and enjoy the fire and enjoy each other and enjoy these wonderful, comfortable chairs, even if you want to. So,
Yeah,
my goodness, Virginie, I can't tell you how comfortable this one is. I think I might move this one into my office, in fact. Excellent. Sweetie, thanks so much for letting us be here. What a joy.